Hi, it's Richard again from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with the second chapter from our Decision Services online learning. This chapter is entitled Differences to Oracle Policy Modeling. We're going to look at high-level, big-picture differences. Later chapters will allow us to view these details at a more granular level and also practice working with them. Let's look at the agenda. We'll begin in just a moment by stating a couple of important introductory points. Then we'll break down the big picture differences into 4 categories. Visual differences, so user interface or other cosmetic changes. Language differences, specifically changes to how we write rules. Concept differences, ideas that exist in decision services but not in Oracle Policy Modeling. And then a final catch-all category, other differences, to cover off anything that didn't fit in the previous 3 categories. Finally, we'll finish off with a summary. So here's our first slide, and it introduces an important strategic point for what follows. When you first look at decision services, it is tempting to assume that what you're looking at is essentially a clone or a copy of Oracle Policy Modeling in a web browser. However, there are enough minor and major changes that it soon becomes very clear that we are not dealing with a copy of an existing idea. We're in fact dealing with a new product. And our study and our investigation of decision services should always bear this in mind. This is not a 14-year-old product. This is a brand new product that is, of course, inspired by much of the functionality of Oracle Policy Modeling, but it is not limited to and it is not constrained by it. So this chapter aims to lay out pretty much the most obvious differences. Many more will become clear in later chapters and in the demonstrations. Let's start with big picture visual differences. The most obvious one is that in a decision services, there are no Word or Excel documents, since we are in a web browser. So there's no concept of Excel, Word, pages, documents, chapters. Everything is written in one place, in one continuous document. Equally, there are no folders. Your decision service is simply in one specific place. However, a decision service can be broken into blocks. In the screenshot on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a block. It's the rectangular area with a black title. A block can contain one or more rules. It can contain tables or things called object tables. In the screenshot on the right, the block contains one rule. A block can also contain inline comments and other elements for documentation purposes. If you look at the screenshot on the right, you will also see that there is some content outside of the block. Specifically above the block, you will see the word rules and some commentary underneath. Let's take a little closer look at this. First of all, inside your decision service, you can write what we call documentation. There is simple formatting, specifically 4 different headings and a normal font, these styles can be used to document your rules. Notice the second paragraph. These styles exist only outside of blocks, so they're perfect for general documentation that is not specific to any given rule or is trying to give an overview of what a given section of your decision service does. Once you are inside a block, as you can see in the screenshot on the left-hand side of the page, it is also possible to use what are now known as inline comments. To a certain extent, they function in a way that is similar to comments in Oracle Policy Modeling. You can select an existing rule, for example, and you can place it into comment format, essentially deactivating the rule until you remove the comment, at which point it will become a rule again. The difference, or the minor difference with Oracle Policy Modeling, is that you can also just use it as a inline comment. It doesn't have to be used to comment out something. So next comes the question, how do I add comments? Well, if you want to add comments using one of the 4 heading styles or the normal style, in your decision service, you'll need to be outside of a block. So your cursor will need to be in a blank part of the decision service. Positioning the cursor and then clicking the ellipsis, which is the button with the 3 dots, will allow you to then select the required format. You are free to then type the comment or add whatever normal text it is that you want to outside of your block. Adding inline comments is similar but different. Once you are inside a block, and of course we will look at blocks in much more detail later, place the cursor where you want to add the inline comment and use the ellipsis button, which in this case it will display on the edge of the block. You can see it in the screenshot. It's the 3 dots just below the mouse cursor. And you can select inline comment. So you can use it just to provide context, such as this text, or you can use it just like you use comments in Oracle Policy Modeling Word documents, for example. So here's a second example. I have a rule which I have selected in its totality with the mouse. Then I click the ellipsis button and I choose Change to Inline Comment, at which point it becomes an inline comment. It just becomes text. If I repeat the process, I will see then that there is a Enable button, which enables me to change it back into a functioning rule if I need to. So this use is much more similar to what you will have known in Oracle Policy Modeling Word documents. Still in the writing rules similar but different category, we have the notion of indentation. Just like when you write a rule in Oracle Policy Modeling and use level 1, level 2, level 3, and so on, and in Word that will display as colored text, in decision services, you can indent text in rules. Indentation is required, and indeed the decision service editing tool will tell you when you've forgotten to do some indentation, and it will instruct you that you need it when you use standard things such as the aggregations like all or any, and you access it still through the ellipsis button, the 3 dots, and you select indent more or indent less. While we're at it, you'll notice that there are keyboard shortcuts for all of these typical keyboard manipulations. One area that is visually quite different is the notion of errors. Unlike Oracle policy modeling, there is no validate button. There is no concept of validation, in fact. Errors are displayed as you type. Sometimes the errors will display because you haven't finished typing, or because you haven't performed a step which would immediately make the error disappear. So not all errors need to be treated immediately. However, whenever you see an error message, it will be first of all manifest through a number, such as the 1 you can see, which is referring to one error on that line. When I click the number, I will see an error message or a description of what the problem seems to be. Equally, in the top right-hand corner of my decision service, I will see a summary, which you can see in this case says 3 errors in rules. When I click that summary, a drop-down will appear, and I can pick from one of the errors in the global error count, and when I click it, I will be navigated to the location of the error, and the text will be highlighted. So similar but different to the kind of thing we had in Oracle Policy Modeling, where validation was required, but if there was an error message, we could select the error message and go to the error message in order to be able to fix it. In this particular screenshot, the second and third errors can't determine a value for attribute is typical of rules that have not yet been completed or things that are still ongoing. What it's essentially saying is that we've written something which appears to be a field, a variable, an attribute, but there's absolutely no other reference to it, so it's hard to know whether it's an input or output, whatever it is. Still in the subject of cosmetic, or shall we say user interface related changes, the main toolbar of Decision Services has a couple of really interesting features. Number one is that when you're editing a decision service, to see the list of decision services or go and look at another decision service, you need first to get out of the decision service you're in, which is the purpose of that arrow that you can see labeled number 1. Number 2 is where you can type change at any time the name of the project, and you can change your mind later on if you wish. Button number 3, which is on the extreme right-hand side, is extremely important. It saves a development version of your decision service. So it's kind of the equivalent of uploading, pushing a version to the hub in Oracle Policy Modeling. The difference is all you have to do is click commit. When you click commit, you should wait until you see the message that says saved underneath, which confirms that your version has been committed. During typing, you may also see that in location number 4, automatic saves are performed. The only thing that actually creates a version is the commit button. Commit does not mean deploy. Commit simply means create a saved version of my decision service in the development. When I click the drop-down number 5, I can always see a list of all of the versions, and we'll talk about that in just a second. For debugging purposes, we can use the twin state button number 6 to switch between editing mode and debugging mode, which we'll call live mode, since that's what's on the button. We're going to dig down deeper into all of these changes in due course. Here's a zoom onto the commit process. When you commit a version it's creating a development version of your decision service. You can access the list of versions at any time from that version's dropdown. You can select any version at any time to review it. They will all be in read-only except for the draft version, which is, of course, the version that is being edited, ready to be committed. So I appreciate that that was a lot of user interface changes. At this stage, you don't need to remember all the details. Personally, I think you need to simply focus on the fact that there's no Word, there's no Excel. There are similar editing tools, and the big new concept is the idea of rules being inside a block. If it helps you, you can think of blocks as a way to structure your decision service, just like you would have used Word documents or Word pages or Excel spreadsheets in the past. But a block is much more flexible. Now let's move on to language differences. This is going to be very easy because at the time of recording, late March 2022, decision services can only be written in English. We are given to understand that other languages are in the pipeline, but at the moment, English is the requirement. The user interface of the hub, we already know, as I'm sure you do, can be displayed in many languages. This does not change what's written above. The parser will only recognize English correctly. Now let's look at other hands-on related changes. First of all, functions. The list of available functions is different. At a high level, there are, for example, no temporal reasoning functions. The notion of temporal reasoning does not exist in a decision service. There are, as a whole, fewer functions available right now. And there is a whole new concept of an object which has its own set of functions, which are familiar, like instance sum, but there are a few new functions. Since we just spoke about the idea of an object, we can now focus on concept or conceptual differences. The concept of an object is similar, but not identical to that of an entity. There are major differences, particularly in the area of inference. You'll discover this in later chapters, so we're not going to worry about it for now. But we need to understand and accept that they are two different concepts. They have a different vocabulary. For example, the concept of a relationship, which is something quite common in Oracle policy modeling, since every time you create an entity, you have a containment relationship, and you can create a multitude of reference relationships. This concept does not exist in objects today. I say that today because who knows, it might change, but right now it doesn't exist. Another major concept difference is a decision service, as we saw previously, is developed using this web interface, and we use the commit button, which you can see on the right, to create development versions. The deploy functionality is to be found in the Actions menu. Deploying a decision service is very similar, if not identical, to deploying a project from Oracle Policy Modeling. So just like how in Oracle Policy Modeling you have the notion of a repository where you store development versions and deployments where you have deployment versions, decision services have a set of development versions managed using the commit button, and then they have the deploy action to actually make the deployment. But there are still some significant differences, as we'll see. Here for reference is a screenshot on the left-hand side of the deploy dialog. And you'll notice that the deploy dialog looks very similar to when you deploy from Oracle Policy Modeling. You choose a deployment name, which is not necessarily the same name as the decision service. You choose a workspace, and you add some comments. Other big-time differences that are, in a way, necessities of the web environment. All export and import facilities use JSON for the file format. So you can export and import projects, but they will be in JSON format. Notice the second point. This is perhaps obvious, but worth restating. Testing and debugging will occur in the web application as well. Keyboard shortcuts exist for almost everything, and you can find them using that link. And unlike Oracle Policy Modeling, where renaming a project is typically just renaming a file on your hard disk, you can rename the project, the decision service, by editing or re-editing the name in the top of the editing window. You may be asking yourself at this stage, who needs to do what in the life cycle of a decision service? Just like with Oracle Policy Modeling, you will leverage roles to ensure that the right people get to do the right things. So you'll notice that on the left-hand side, only the manager role can create a new decision service project, import an existing project, and only a manager can create contracts, which will be the subject of our next chapter, and only a manager can rename a project. Manager or author can open an existing project, edit it, commit it, save it, view it, deploy it, share a project with others, export a project, and basically debug. The new role type of viewer, which was introduced in release 22A, is allowed to open an existing project, view the history, look at old stuff, but cannot make any changes, can, however, export a project, perhaps to import it into another hub. Notice on the right-hand side, all three of these user types can test the rules and observe the URL endpoints to find out how to run the project as a decision service. Again, all of these topics we will see again in more detail later. So what do we need to finish on? Well, we previously summarized the visual differences at around about the halfway point. We saw that there weren't that many language differences. We should simply call them missing elements, things that today are not implemented and may not be implemented, such as temporal reasoning and relationships. In terms of concept differences, the big item is that an entity no longer is an entity. It has been replaced by a concept called an object. And an object is similar to, but different to an entity. We also briefly looked, for reference purposes, at the different roles that will be involved in creating a decision service. The manager, the author, and potentially the new viewer role, which was introduced in 22A. So now that we've heard about the big picture changes, you're going to see a short demonstration of some of those changes to help you get a handle on what it's going to be like working with decision services. See you after the demo in the next chapter. So in this demo to accompany Chapter 2, we're going to look at the basic workflow differences that you will notice if you're moving from Oracle Policy Modeling to decision services. We'll try and highlight along the way real-life examples. So to do that, I'm going to use this particular user, which is a standard hub user that has just enough permission to edit to both create and edit decision services. Remember that if you're an author, you can edit existing decision services, but if you're a manager, you can create new services as well. And in chapter 3, which is coming up, we'll also talk about what a manager can do. So here I am on the standard projects page. You can see that I have already got 2 projects that are of type decision service. And the big change, of course, is in the top right-hand corner. I have the create button. Let's use one existing one here because it's easier to focus when you have something in front of you rather than a blank page. The first thing that you need to get used to is that there's no Word and no Excel, that basically everything happens in this design window. And you can see that the page is made up of several different kinds of information. We have information at the top, and then we have these rectangles. So let's go ahead and use this button here. I'm just pressing enter to get some space in here, and then you can see that at the top I have a number of different styles. So if you're used to creating headers and documentation in your Word documents and your Excel pages, this is the new way to do it. So I'm adding some heading 1 and then some normal. So those formats are only valid outside of what are called blocks. So the blocks are those rectangles you can see on the screen. I have 2 blocks currently, one that has a simple assignment rule and one that has a table in it. I'm going to go ahead now and look at this menu and choose to create a new empty block, because an empty block is where you write rules. You can only write rules inside a block. So if you think in terms of paragraphs or chapters or logical sections, then a block is pretty close to that. We'll see more about blocks in chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, but I'm going to go and create a new block here and actually write a rule straight inside it. It's going to be I'll do 2 rules, and I will keep one of them. So let's create a simple assignment rule here that does a mathematical calculation between 2 fields. And then let's drop down into the next line with return, and let's create a Boolean rule this time. There we go, and invent something. So you'll notice a couple of things is that as you type, the formatting appears pretty much automatically. You'll have noticed, for example, that when I created the Boolean rule, that the if is formatted slightly differently to the customer is happy. And you'll notice that the second line, the condition, is automatically indented. Similarly, in the rule just above it, you'll see that the assigned attribute is in bold and the others aren't. So there's a degree of formatting that's going to happen immediately for you, which is kind of cool. And you'll also notice that there's a bunch of errors that have showed up straight away as soon as I started typing. So you're going to have to get used to this, is that here you can see that I have 2 errors in this rule relating to the 2 inputs and 1 error in the second rule relating also to the condition input. And you have a kind of rather nice summary in the top right-hand corner here, which shows all the errors. And when you click on one of them, it highlights the important text that you need to be focusing on. So there's nothing wrong with these rules right now. It simply means that we've forgotten part of the standard workflow of working with decision services. And that's because here we have a rule with 2 inputs, and decision services really doesn't understand what these inputs are at all. And to make this nice and simple, first of all, this is a feature that you will need to work with all the time. It doesn't stop you building rules, but let's keep it simple to say that whenever you create a rule like this, you need to worry about, have you declared it as an input? So in this case, this particular attribute hasn't been declared as an input, so the decision service doesn't know what to do with it. There's a very distinct difference between inputs and outputs in the world of decision services, and these are both inputs and they need to be declared as such. So rather than waste time going into the details of inputs and outputs, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, I'll simply show you how to get rid of the error. You go to the inputs, you add an input of the correct type with the text that you just wrote, and you click done, and the error disappears, because now decision services know that that's an input. And I'll go ahead and do the same for the second input. And you can see that the errors have disappeared for that first rule. And just to make things simple, I'll get rid of the second rule for now. So I have created a rule in a block and I have edited it. You can see that it's being saved as I go along. I didn't have to do anything. I'm currently working on the draft version. I can look back at any of the other versions that I've created in the past through this drop-down. When I select one of those versions, I can view it and I can see the details of it, which is really rather nice. I can click on anything and see what kind of attribute it is and whether it's an input, whether it's calculated or whatever. But I can't edit. I cannot edit any of this because it's an old version. If I want to go back to editing, I need to go to the top right-hand corner and I need to either click continue editing or simply select the draft version again from the drop-down, because the draft is the version that you are going to work on at all times. And when you click the draft version, if you're an author or a manager, you should be able to edit it. Now let's think about debugging, which you're all very familiar with in Oracle Policy Modeling, and I'd say that the live button is as close as it gets to a real debugger. When I click on it, you'll notice that I get lots of little tooltips that help me understand the behavior of my rule. So it says, for example, that the third answer is currently null. Well, that's because the input part 1 and the input part 2 are also null. The live mode means I can go to where I had my inputs here and I can actually enter values for those inputs. And I can see the answer live here on screen. So it's really a nice way of debugging your decision service, and it allows you to test any of your rules live on the screen. As you can see in the upper area in the other rules, there are lots of other features that we'll talk about in due course that help you identify where things might be going right or things might be going wrong with your rule. So the live mode is the best way to edit as you go. With my rule, I also now want to click the commit button, which creates a development version. So I now have created a new version in my list. There it is, version 38. And if I make more edits, I will still, of course, be editing the draft version. So each time I click commit, I record a new version into the development history. We spoke a moment ago about the live mode. In the Actions menu, you have a couple of options I'm going to talk about right now, the first of which is the Deploy option. So if you're familiar with the deploy workflow in Oracle Policy Modeling, this will feel very familiar because you can change the deployment name, select the workspace, add some comments, and if you have the sufficient rule, if you're a manager basically, you can activate it as well. So you get exactly the same user workflow as you did with Oracle Policy Modeling. I'll cancel that because I don't actually want to deploy it yet. Going back to the Actions menu, let's talk about a couple of the other options in here. I'm going to talk about the Export option, which will export your project, but it will export it in a different format than you're used to. It'll export it as a JSON file, which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with if you're working with JavaScript or any of those kind of programming languages. This JSON file contains the definition of your project and includes things such as all of its properties, its version, and its inputs and outputs, which you'll remember corresponds to what you saw here on the left-hand side of the page. Now, if live is kind of like a live debugger, you may be wondering what this option is here that says run via REST. It's kind of a debugger, but it's slightly different, and you need to understand the differences between the two. So I'm going to go to run via REST and pull up that page. You'll notice that the run via REST has a kind of input and output segment here down underneath where it says try it. And you'll notice that I have the ability to enter values for attributes. You'll notice that I'm actually entering values for the attributes that were present in the top part of the decision service. And I've also entered in for the input part 1 and the input part 2. But what you might find strange is that in the right-hand side here where it says output, there's absolutely nothing relating to my 12 multiplied by 12. The answer isn't there. That's because the run via REST is only going to show you the inputs and outputs as they are declared in the previous screen. And if you go back here, you may remember I set these two up as inputs, but the third answer is not declared as an output, so it will not show up in run via REST. So run via REST is very much input and output focused. It's because it wants to give you the ability to test the service as if you were a third-party application. So the third-party application would see nothing about the third answer because the third answer wasn't declared in the output section. So the big difference between run via REST and live is that run via REST is driven by the inputs and outputs and only shows you the output that is declared, whereas the live button is basically give me a debugger that allows me to debug anything and everything in my service. By the way, the other items that you can see here, these links we'll talk about in the chapters about deployment and documentation. So just to wrap it up, that when you're working with decision services, there are two debuggers, one which is just a pure debug as you go, and the other one which is debugging defined by the inputs and outputs of your service. That wraps it up for our short tour of these workflow differences. See you in the next chapter about contracts.